All right. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. We will go ahead and get started here. Again, this is Sean with Flux here. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for our Permissions 101 webinar. We'll be going over the basics of the mysterious permissions section in the admin panel. To that effect, this session is going to be directed towards users with admin privileges. So if you do not have access to the admin panel, contact your admin to gain access if your role within the foundation allows for this. So after the overview, we will be having a question and answer with a couple of our Fluxxperts on permissions. Today we have Dane, who is a longtime Fluxer and a QA engineer, as well as Kevin, who is a customer success manager and former Tier 2 support specialist. So you're in good hands today with the group that we have. And if you should have any questions at any time during the session, and again, we do stress at any time, so as things come up, go ahead and feel free to enter them into the chat section. But before we get started with the overview, let's all get familiar with where the chat function lives. So a little activity we like to do every time. So at the bottom of your screens, you should see the chat button. I'd like you to go ahead and click that to pull up the chat window. And now once you have it up, let's go ahead and have you enter your favorite TV show of all time. You know, my own personal one, I'd probably say is Saved by the Bell. I know. It's probably because I look like Screech. I think I'm cool like Zach, but really I'm Mr. Belding. But, you know, that's just me. What do we have? Oh, Fresh Prince. All right, I'm digging it. Charlie's Angels. That's a great one. Futurama. Duh. All right. Game of Thrones. That's what I'm talking about. That's probably my second favorite one. Some people call me Sean Snow around here, just FYI. Space Ghost. Oh, that's classic. X-Files. All right. This is awesome. A good cross-section of everybody's interest. I'm digging all the shows. So great job. Everybody knows where the chat function is, so use it when you have a question. So now back to the topic. The majority of this webinar is going to define all of the terms, models, and permissions in the admin panel. Part 2 of the webinar will get into practical uses of permissions, as well as tips and tricks for builder proper permission sets. So definitely make sure that you register for that webinar once you've completed this session with us. And that's going to be scheduled out about 2 weeks from now. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the overview portion of our webinar today. So in today's webinar, we'll be looking into configuring permissions in the admin panel, defining the actual permission, defining the related model type, and of course, our Fluxxperts will be available at the end of the overview to answer questions about both or all of these different permission questions that you have. So let's start with looking at how to add permissions, a permission set to a profile in the admin panel. All right, so to add the permission set to a profile, you'll first need to go into your admin panel, and once you've done that, you'll go into your user settings. Then you'll need to select the profile you wish to add the permission set to. In our example, we're adding it to the employee profile. You'll then want to select the Rights tab. Now, you should be able to see the permission sets that already exist on the profile. Almost all of your profiles should already have permissions configured there, as your implementation specialist should have already configured this for you, based on your individual business process. Before we continue, I definitely want to add that permissions are something that should not be changed in a large scale since, again, you've already worked with your implementation team to build this out. Adding or removing a permission set here and there is totally fine. Things happen. But as a general build practice, it is a good idea to first make any changes on your pre-production instance to make sure that Any proposed change is validated and works as expected before doing anything on production. However, if you feel like you need to make a large-scale permission change, please make sure to reach out and contact your customer success manager before you do so. They can help determine whether or not you'll need a Fluxxpert to go in and help make these changes before any possible mistakes can be done or may be done on your production site. All right, so we got our disclaimer out of the way. Let's get back to the tutorial. So going back to where we left off, we're on the Rights tab. From here, we would want to click the green plus to add a permission set. By clicking on the green plus button, you'll see this modal. The first thing you'll want to select is the permission name. This is the action the user is able to take. We like to call this the what, as in what is the user able to do. We'll define each of the choices here in just a little bit. Next is the model type. This is the where, as in where the user is able to make the allowed action. And last but not least is the checkbox that determines whether the permission set is allowed or not allowed. As a best practice, we recommend that this checkbox always remains checked when adding a permission. This is because we want to have the permissions logic be, if you don't want a user to have a certain permission set, then we don't have to have it here. Once you've selected your desired permission set, click Save in the bottom right of the modal to add it to the list. And that's pretty much it. Adding a permission to the profile isn't very hard. The key is knowing which permission you need for which model type. So now that we've taken a look at the how to add the permissions, let's start defining the permission names. All right, so just to FYI, this might be very tedious. So we'll try to go slow so that we don't go overboard with dumping a bunch of Flux lingo all at once. And also, as a reminder, we always post this recording to the knowledge base so that you can always reference back to this video. Each permission name determines what a user can do. But additionally, we define what a user can do on which records or model. I know this can be confusing, but we're going to go down the selections one by one and define each of them. So first we have the list permissions. They would give the user permission to see the list view in a card. If you select List Own, the user will be able to see the list view of records that are created by them. List All will allow the user to see the list view of all models. Selecting All on any of these permissions will make it so that the user has the permission for all model types. You would not need to specify a model type. Simply selecting List will allow you to control which model type the user is able to see in the list view. So for example, selecting the list permission paired with the request reports model will allow the user to see the list view in the reports card specifically. The next permission is View. This allows the user to see records. View Own will allow users to see records that are created by them. View All will allow users to see every record. View paired with the model type will allow a user to see records in a specified card. Let's move to the Create permission. This will allow the user to create new records. This oftentimes correlates to the green plus button. Specifically for the Create permission, we recommend to only use Create and pair it with a specific model type that you want the user to be able to create records in. Up next is the update permission. This would allow the user to actually edit a record. Update own would allow the user to edit records that are created by them. Update all will allow the user to update every record indiscriminately. Update paired with a model type will allow the user to only update records that fall within the specified model type. All right, I bet you've probably guessed it by looking at the screen, but up next is the ominous delete permission. This would give the user the ability to delete records. For the most part, we always suggest to keep historical data versus deleting it. There are a number of ways to keep data in your system without it either messing up your numbers or getting in the way. Before you delete anything, always think of alternative solutions. Having said that, we also suggest limiting the amount of users you give the ability to delete. As with the previous permissions, delete own will allow users to delete records created by them. Delete all, which, I'm sorry, gives me a little anxiety here, allows the user to delete all records. Delete paired with a model type allows the user to delete records in that specified model type. All right, so lastly, we have the all permissions. Use these sparingly. I know you probably trust your coworkers and they're probably honest, good people, but I wouldn't give my ATM PIN number to my best friend. I mean, that could be me. I could have trust issues, but anyway, back to all permissions, all. This is the key to the Cadillac. This would give the user every single permission on every single model type. All permissions paired with a model type would give the user all permissions on that specific model type. Now, model types. If you've ever taken a look at this dropdown, you know that there's tons to choose from here. I don't think any of us has the time or attention span to sit through each one. So what we've done is we've narrowed this down to the most useful and commonly used model types. If you have a question about any of the model types that we do not cover, remember that we have a couple of Fluxxperts here ready to answer all of your questions during Q&A. So go ahead and throw those questions in the chat. The most commonly used model types are notes, request, request report, request transactions, user, and request review. Most model types are tied to cards that are easily accessed from the Add Cards menu, while some models are tied to pieces of functionality that are built into other models. A good example of the latter is the Notes model. When adding a permission using the Notes model, it'll give permission to use parts of the note component which lives on other model types. As an example, the create permission for the notes model will allow you to create a note in the notes component that could be in place on your request form. A good example of a model type that is tied to a card that can be accessed from the Add Card menu is the request model. This model will determine if the given profile has the ability to interact with parts of the request or grant cards. As an example, the create permission for the request model will allow you to create a grant request record. The next most commonly used permission is request reports. This model is for, I'm sure you've guessed it, the reports or requirements card. Permissions for this model type will allow you to see and interact with reports that are tied to requests and payments. Right up there with request reports is the request transaction model. This model is for the payments card. Permissions for this model type will allow you to see and interact with payment records. Next, we have the user model. This model is for your people card. Permissions for this model type will allow you to see and interact with the user records that live in your system. And finally is the request review model. This model is for the review card. Permissions for this model type will allow you to see and interact with review records that are connected to your request records. This model type is traditionally only given to the reviewer profile, but it may vary depending on your organization's processes. All right, so that's pretty much going to wrap it up for the overview portion of today's webinar. So now we're going to pivot into our Q&A session with our Fluxxperts. So again, today we have Dane and Kevin on our panel. Before we kick it off, Dane, do you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Excuse me. My name is Dane, obviously. I've been with Flux for 4 years.
Hey.
Started out in support, worked my way up to Tier 2, and then I moved over to the QA team. It's been quite a ride in here for 4 years.
That's, yeah, I bet. Dane is our future CEO, I'm sure.
Yeah.
All right, so thanks, Dane. Next up is a friendly voice and face I'm sure you guys have all interacted with in the past. Kevin, welcome back.
Thank you.
What's going on with you?
I'm sure everyone's tired of me now. It's Kevin, your favorite CSM. I've been here for almost 3 years now coming up. Just like Dan, started in support and kind of just worked my way and weaseled my way into a customer success job. So
I would like to say that it was looked at as finessing your way in rather than weaseling. But hey, nonetheless. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. And just a FYI, for anybody attending any future training webinars with Ask a Fluxxpert Q&A sessions, you can always submit any questions ahead of time to your CSMs, and we can include those on the deck. But again, we have the free-form chat box that is available for you to enter your questions at any time. So let's take a look at a couple of these questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor for new questions. But feel free to enter them in at any time. So first off, we have a question is, where do you set admin privileges? So Kevin, can you help us expand upon that?
Oh, I got the easy one, thank you. So setting admin privileges isn't going to be in that menu that we were looking at for the majority of this webinar. You don't even have to go into the admin panel to set admin privileges if you are currently an admin. So if you're an admin and you want to give someone else admin privileges, what you have to do is you have to pull up their user card, and around where you see the roles, you should see just a clickable link that says, I think it's add admin role. And then, so that's how you do that, not in the admin panel.
Thanks, that's a great question. Now, side note to that, what permission sets do admins have?
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure they get all permissions all. Yep. Dane agrees, and Dane's in QA, so I'm right.
Yeah. Now, remember, that's that one that kind of comes with a lot of caution. So all permissions all, given the keys to the Cadillac there. Thank you so much.
I'd also like to point out that all permissions all will not get anyone into the admin panel. So that's kind of where the admin is also effective in the admin panel.
That's a great tip as well. Thank you very much. You could set a particular employee profile for all permissions all, but they still won't have access to get into the admin panel.
Yeah.
Great. So next up we have, what does the client store's permissions do? That was a one for me. I had to wrap my head around. I was like, I mean, is there a merch store? Do people buy foundation sweaters and stuff? But so yeah, with client store's permission, Dane, do you mind helping us out with that one?
Sure. It's one that I also struggled with for a long time. Client stores, it gives the individual the access to dashboards. So if you have an employee who wants to switch between dashboards or even access to dashboards such as templates and shared cards, they need the client store's permission.
Got it. So it makes perfect sense now. The naming convention lines up so well. But no, actually, I do see the value of that. That's a big one, an important one. Without having the right client stores permissions, then now I know there's been some changes of late. I believe client stores, it's recommended for grantees, reviewers to be all permissions, correct?
Yes.
Client stores all, right? Great. Next up we have, if I don't want a grantee to be able to see the audit component, do I remove their notes permission? That's a good question. Dane, do you mind helping us out with that one?
Sure. So the audit history, I'm assuming is what they mean. That isn't specifically tied to a permission. So the best way to actually hide this from a grantee is to go to the visibility tab on the form and just select the profiles that you do want to see the audit history.
Okay. I get it. Thank you very much. So we're going to move on, and we have a couple more questions that we'll go through that were pre-submitted, and then we'll get into some of the questions that have come in thus far. First off, we have, what do I do if I want to build a view-only profile for external auditors? I can't seem to get the right combo of permissions. That's could be a tough one, and that's definitely a good fit for an auditor. You want them to be able to check everything out, but you don't want them to be able to interact with certain records. So, Kevin, do you mind helping us out and expand upon that one?
Sure. When I got this question ahead of time, I was like, oh, this person's on the ball, because this is essentially a lot of what we're going to talk about in the follow-up webinar for this, the tips and tricks and the cool things you could do with permissions. But I know this was talked about in the community as well before, so if you guys want to track down that conversation, shameless plug for the community there, check that out. Essentially what you want to do is you want to make sure that they have view permissions, but don't give them update, create, or delete permissions. And of course, there's going to be a specific combination of that we'll get into in the next webinar that's going to show you, how a functional view-only profile looks. But I think another thing that Dane also mentioned to me too was the executive category. When you set that in the user settings is also read-only. Right, Dan?
Yep.
Mm.
And don't forget list. List is an important one.
List is definitely important.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they can view the records, but their list view is just going to be a bunch of blank little placeholders.
Right.
So they wouldn't really know what that they're clicking on until they click on it, which I guess would work, but it slows them down. So depends on how nice you want to be. All right. So next up, thank you very much, by the way. Next up, we have, can I allow an employee to create ad hoc reports without giving them admin access? You know what? I know that there's a way to do this. And Dane, I think you're ready to help shed some light on that.
So this is one of our most requested features in terms of ad hoc reporting. And unfortunately, employees cannot create, or they should not be able to delete ad hoc reports. But what you can do is you can give them super user rights. Essentially, a super user is someone who is like an admin. They can do everything, but they can't get into the admin panel. And they can create ad hoc reports. I know that for the next year, the following year, we will be expanding on that specific feature as well.
Great. I love enhancements to the current functionality. But yeah, so it's like you're giving them the control on the front end, right? Your dashboard, your stage area, but they can't get under the hood and go into the admin panel. So that hopefully should free up some of your time as an admin to take away from, creating these ad hoc reports, put it in the hands of your trusty staff, and keep you in control of what's going on under the hood. All right, so another question we have submitted here looks to be, does permissions affect the user's ability to advance in the workflow? You know what, Kevin, I think this one you probably can share some good insight with.
Love it. So no, permissions don't play a part in this. So your ability to see the actual workflow button and advance the record is determined by the role and what the allowed roles are on that button in the workflow. Now, there could be times where you have permissions, you have the ability to, you see those workflow buttons, but there's functionality within the form that you don't have permissions to do. So it's going to always be like a combination, but the actual ability to advance the record in the workflow, permissions doesn't have a say in that at all.
Mm. Interesting. Thank you very much.
Of course.
All right, so now that should do it for the questions that were pre-submitted. So thank you everybody who had expanded on some of those questions there. So next up, we're going to get into a couple of the questions that have been submitted through the chat panel. We have, do admin permissions, all, override employee permissions? So for example, if the employee profile cannot delete, will adding an admin role allow them to delete? You know, that's a good one. Dane, do you mind helping answer that one for us?
Sure. So by giving them the admin role, they should be able to delete. But this approach isn't exactly what we would call our best practice. Essentially, just because a user can't do something doesn't mean that we should just give them the admin rights. The best practice here would be to see why they can't delete it, whether they're missing a role, whether they're actually just missing the delete permission, or if there's something in the global settings that's blocking them from deleting. So I think you could use admin permission as a kind of Hail Mary, but it should be used as a Hail Mary.
So maybe in like a very time-sensitive crunch, and you need to accomplish a quick task, and don't have time to kind of dig through the configuration, with great oversight, you can enable that and then make sure you remove it and then do the due diligence like everybody does to really kind of straighten them up and set them up for success long term.
Exactly. Also, an alternative to that I just thought of was the super user rights. Let's say you don't want them to get into the admin panel, but you still need them to delete. Super user would be a perfect role for that as well, or right, I should say.
Right. As a quick fix, that's a great thought there. All right.
Actually, sorry,
please
just keep talking.
Yeah.
I just love helping you guys out. So there's actually if you are an admin user, there is a permissions report that you can run as a live report. So every site actually has a live report at the very bottom called permissions. And what you can do is you can select that specific profile and see what permissions are set up. It's easier to identify what they're blocked on. I've used it quite a bit as well.
That's a great pro tip. There's some very quality reports that come standard with every Flux instance that are available in the live reports. I think sometimes that does get underutilized or just kind of as an afterthought type deal. And we try to focus on, I got to build out this, crazy intense ad hoc report or Excel report or, filtering my cards to get what I need. Do spend some time. I know that everybody has plenty of that to take a look at what's in the live reports. I bet there's at least one thing in there that may help you out. All right, so thank you very much. We're going to move on to another question here. So from our Space Ghost friend, what is the best strategy for making a report visible to and editable by only one user among the 3 users related to a grant? Is it a permission thing, a visibility thing? Is it a role thing? What kind of thing is this? So, Kevin, do you mind telling us what kind of thing this would be?
Or
Dane.
Just jump in there.
You might have stumped me here.
Hey, that's the goal, right?
So this came up about a week ago with another client. And kind of digging into it, unfortunately, our system doesn't really allow that kind of granular setup. What we want to do is we kind of have permissions for the general, kind of the general users, the grantees. You could set up visibility, but just setting up the conditions, and you would have to have a specific flag on the user card. It's definitely possible, but it's just going to be a huge undertaking to do that. Because you'd have to slap everything in a group, you'd have to have conditions on that group, and then I don't know how that's going to affect system performance as well. So it's just something that we don't quite offer out of the box.
Huge, yes.
Yeah, it would be a lot of form.
So I guess just like right now, the best thing to do is just like on the Grantee portal, just filter down the card as much as possible.
Exactly.
I think that's the only thing that's the most feasible kind of solution as of right now, I think.
Yeah, and if it's an internal user, actually that's perfect. As an internal user, you could just assign them a dashboard and that they can switch away from. That's another way to do it. Just to cover internal and external users.
Yeah, that definitely took some thought on my end though. So
Yeah, no, that's a complex one. And that's great to hear. Yeah, always inquire with support for anything else that you may have or added clarity. Happy to help out. It's a great job thus far. All right, so let's see what else we have here. Again, now's the chance to go ahead and submit your questions into the chat function. I know everybody knows where it lives and how to use it. We'll give it a moment or two to allow everybody who may want to type something in to go ahead and do so, but we, just FYI, that may be the end of our questions, and that's okay. But now's the opportunity. We have the time available. All right, well, that looks like that may be all that's come in thus far for the pre-submitted questions and the live chat questions. So thank you, everybody, for participating. I know, Dane, we were mentioning about some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in the next permissions webinar. And you were talking about a little bit about doc types, right?
Yep.
So that's a huge part of permissions as well, is getting into the doc types. And 2 weeks from now, as it's currently standing, we're going to be doing the kind of the best tips and tricks on using permissions and some examples and how-tos and such. So we'll be getting into more of the details of the doc types as well. So then we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for today. Today we addressed configuring permissions in the admin panel, defining the different permission names, defining the different model types, and then we just wrapped up our Q&A with our friendly Fluxxperts here. So as always, if you ever want to access this video recording, as well as all of our past training webinars, you can check us out at our knowledge base at flux.zendesk.com. That'll also have a list of our upcoming webinars, links to register for future webinars, and of course, all the past ones under training webinars. Also, the community site is always available, and you can take a look for updates from the webinar team. It also is a great resource for some of the questions that have come in before. You know, your peers and your community of admins, you know, sometimes provide some great insight and a best practice just based on their own experience that you can translate into your use case. But we have a link to the suggestion box in the community. So if you ever want a specific topic on one of these training webinars, go ahead and take a look at that and let us know what we should create. And of course, all of us here within support and Flux are always happy to help you out. So a big thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Dane, and thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate you guys being here with us.
Thanks.
All right, of course. And we hope to host you guys again in our next training. Until then, have a great day.